Welcome back to the third day of the Darla Sewalong. Today is all about the zip back views. So if you are sewing up one of the tie back views, you can skip today and actually tomorrow as well and circle back on day 5 of the Darla Sewalong. Now I'm going to be sewing up 2 different versions of the zip back view. I have this kind of tropical print, which is the jumpsuit version of the zip back, and then this green rayon crepe, which is going to be a dress version of the zip back, and I'm going to be jumping back and forth between the two throughout the lesson today. And in fact, this very first step is just for the dress view of the zip back version. So if you are sewing that, go ahead and grab the bottom skirt portion, and without trimming, we are going to finish the center back edges of each of those back skirt pieces. Now I'm going to do that on my serger, but you can of course zigzag stitch if you prefer. Okay, now that that's done, the next steps are going to be for both the skirt view or the jumpsuit view of the zip back version. So what we're going to do next is we are going to sew 2 lines of gathering stitches along the upper edge of either the skirt or the pant. Now there's different ways to do a gathering stitch, but this is just my preferred method, and feel free to use whatever method you prefer. So the way I like to do it is I run one at 3/8 of an inch from the top edge and another at 5/8 of an inch. I do that because our seam allowance is a 1/2 inch, so that will fall right in the middle of these 2 lines of gathering stitches, which just makes it easier to take them out later on. So when you do this, you're not going to backstitch, but instead you're going to leave long thread tails at either end that you can use for gathering. And you're going to sew these gathering stitches in 3 separate sections. So you're essentially going to leave the pockets out of the gathering. And so you're going to start and stop about 1 inch from the center back and then just outside of each of those side seams when you're gathering. Once again, you're just leaving these pockets free and doing the gathering stitches in 3 separate sections. So both of the backs, and then of course the third section being the entire front. Okay, they should look something like this. Now it's time to go ahead and pull up those gathering stitches along the upper edge of the skirt or pant. You're going to want to adjust them so that they line up with the finished main bodice that we sewed together on day 1 or 2 of the sew along. Now I think like most people, I find this pretty tedious. This is not my favorite thing to do when I'm sewing, but it just takes a little bit of time. You just have to kind of be patient because you really do want these gathers to be pretty evenly distributed so that you don't have any big puckers or folds once you sew the bodice to your skirt or your pant. And I am gathering both the jumpsuit and the skirt version here just so that you can kind of see both. This is obviously a little bit easier for the dress view just because it is not sewn up the back yet, so you can kind of lay it out flat. So it can be a little bit more awkward with a jumpsuit, but still very, very doable. Okay, now you can kind of see me aligning it more to the width of the bodice. Make sure that you're lining up those side seams, notches with the darts. The center back edges should be lined up. I also find that pressing and steaming my gathers once I kind of have them evenly distributed just really helps set those gathers and just makes them much easier to sew. And then once you're happy with the width of your gathers, go ahead and pin it right sides touching the top of your skirt or your pant to the bottom of your bodice. Once again, being really careful to match side seams and center backs and notches. One thing that's pretty important to know is that at first I'm just keeping the pockets free from all of this gathering and all of these pins. And then once I'm happy with the gathering, that everything's really evenly distributed, I'm going to press the pockets and those seam allowances along the side towards the front and over the gathered skirt or pant, and then pin them in place. Okay, I'm just going to show you the whole process again with the jumpsuit instead of the dress version of the zip back view. Once again, I do find the jumpsuit to just be a little bit more awkward to attach to the bodice, and this is just because we've already sewn up the crotch of the jumpsuit, so it just can't lay flat in the same way that the skirt is able to. But you just have to, once again, take your time and just match up all those notches and the side seams and the center backs, and it'll all come together. Okay, once the bodice is pinned to the skirt or the pant, we're going to go over to our sewing machine and we are going to stitch the waist seam at a normal 1/2 inch seam allowance, and you're going through all those layers, including the pockets, which are kind of sandwiched in there. Now, as you'll see here, my personal preference is actually to sew with the gathers up. I think that is backwards from what most people prefer. I think a lot of people say that having the gathers down along your feed dogs just makes the gathers go more evenly, but I just like to be able to see them so I could kind of control and also adjust them as I sew. So once again, you just do whatever you prefer. Okay, it's finally starting to look like a full dress or jumpsuit. So I've attached the bodice on both versions, both the dress and the jumpsuit version of the zip back view. The next thing that we're going to do is, this is kind of personal preference, but is to take some of the bulk out of that waist seam. So on the rayon crepe, I just feel like that dress is lightweight enough that I don't need to do that. But this one, the tropical print, is more of like a linen cotton blend, and so it is a little bit thicker. So instead of like fully grading, which would be to trim both of the seam allowances down, I actually feel like the simplest thing to do is just trim down the seam allowance of the gathered bottom by about half. And that's going to take quite a bit of the bulk out because of all of that gathering as well as the pockets that are in that seam. And then you're going to want to press all of those seam allowances of both the bodice and then also the skirt pant and the pockets all up towards the bodice and away from the bottom. Okay, let's go ahead and turn our dress or our jumpsuit right side out at this point. It really is starting to look like the Darla at this point. Okay, now the next thing that we want to do is just remove any visible basting stitches. Now, because the seam allowance is a 1/2 inch and we sewed our basting stitches at 3/8 and 5/8, that 5/8 of an inch basting stitch should be visible. Sometimes it gets caught a little bit in the seam or whatnot, but generally it should be pretty easy to remove. So just kind of take your time and go along and remove anything that you see under the seam line where the bodice meets the bottom. And then I always like to give that waist seam another press from the right side, just making sure that everything looks good. If there's any areas where maybe the gathering got a little bit weird, maybe it folded and got like tucked weird in your stitching, now is the time to unpick that little part and adjust it and make it look good. Okay, we have a couple just last things that we want to do today just to kind of prepare for inserting the invisible zip tomorrow. So we are going to pin up the center back edges of either your dress or your jumpsuit. The first pin that I always put in is the waist seam, just to make sure that that lines up perfectly. And then go ahead and pin all the rest of the center back seam. Now, if you're sewing up the dress, that center back seam is currently completely open. If you are sewing up the jumpsuit, it is already sewn all the way up to that dot that is at the center back. And then we're going to go over to our sewing machine and add a basting stitch. We're going to baste from the top edge down to that dot. And then once we get to that dot, we'll back stitch, and then we'll continue sewing all the way down to the hem of the dress in a normal stitch length. Now, if you are sewing up the jumpsuit version of the zip back view, the process is essentially the same. So you're going to pin up the center back, and once again, it's already sewed from along the crotch seam up to the dot at center back. Make sure that those waist seams match up perfectly. You're going to pin the center back area that is above the dot, and then we'll go over to our sewing machine, and in a basting stitch, we will baste from the top edge down to that dot. Now the very last thing that we're going to do is we are going to press those seam allowances open that we just sewed. So once again, for the jumpsuit, it should already be pressed below the dot along that crotch curve, and so we will just be pressing the area above the dot and all the way up to the top of the jumpsuit. And this is just in preparation, once again, for the invisible zipper that we are going to be inserting tomorrow. And then for the dress, we will be pressing open the entire center back seam. Okay, and that is it for today. So once again, tomorrow we will be continuing with the zip back views. We will actually be inserting that invisible zipper and finishing out the remainder of the straps and the bodice. I hope this was helpful, and we'll see you tomorrow.